everyone. Welcome to the first talk in the Perspectives in Global Development Seminar Series for the 2023-2024 academic year. For those joining us online for the first time, my name's Terry Tucker. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Global Development and one of the seminar co-organizers. Today's seminar and those that will follow over the weeks and months to come, we'll have weekly seminars, begin with a 30 to 40-minute presentation by a development practitioner, policymaker, scholar. It concludes with a 10 to 15-minute Q&A session. Both the in-person attendees as well as those who are joining us through the webinar are welcome to pose your questions to the speaker. As the seminar series name implies, our goal is to provide a forum for diverse and sometimes competing perspectives, perspectives on development. Today, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Purvi Mehta to share her perspectives on the global conversation around food and agricultural system transformation. Dr. Mehta brings rich experience and insights to this topic, gained from a series of influential leadership roles pertaining to the intersecting concerns of food security and climate adaptation at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and previous roles in other organizations that have historically had a prominent voice in global food security matters. Those roles include head of Asia programs for the International Livestock Research Institute, ILRI, and leadership for the South Asia Biosafety Program managed by the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI. Currently, Dr. Mehta is the Deputy Director for Agriculture Development at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and she's also leading the Foundation's climate adaptation programs globally. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Purvi Mehta.
Thank you very much, Terry. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that that warm welcome. It is really very warm in Ithaca. I wasn't expecting it to be so warm. It could be a bit colder next time, Terry. It means a lot to come to Cornell. As you know, I have had a long history of coming to Cornell very regularly. I was a graduate student 29 years ago and used to work with Ray Wu, and I wasn't at Cornell, I was at NC State, but we had a program with Ray Wu, and I used to come to learn the fundamentals of molecular biology at Cornell. That was 29 years ago, telling of my age. And since then, I've been coming very, very regularly to Cornell. But this trip, it's been after 3 years that I've come here. So really glad to be here in Ithaca. Good to see some very, very familiar faces. Good to see the familiar place and everything. But as I said earlier, there are a few changes that I observed. Number one is a big change in weather. I did not expect Ithaca to be so warm. So that was one change I observed. The second thing is, this morning, I just went for a walk in downtown Ithaca, which, as you know, I do almost every trip. And one big change I observed was I had never seen so many, those little air conditioner units outside the houses in Ithaca. I had never seen that before. And I observed that as a big change coming after 3 years. Cute little small air conditioner unit, almost as if bespoke to Ithaca, but that's a big change. And I want to come back to that change that I observed today. And I want to come back to that change in the context of some of the developing country work that we do later in my talk. But today, I was guided by Terry, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we mean by inclusive growth and will talk mainly about also the approach that we are taking at the Gates Foundation on inclusive growth, and my new role, which is a new nature of work at the Gates Foundation, which is the climate adaptation work. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And at the end, I also wanted to sort of flag some opportunities as to how an international organization like the Cornell University can play a very, very crucial role in this whole field of climate adaptation. And I really wanted to discuss some collaborative ideas, but at the same time wanted to understand the various perspectives that there are there in the room. So I wanted to have that more in the interaction mode. I mean, agriculture, we've been cultivating for at least 11,600 years now. We know our dependence on agriculture continues for various things, the fundamental being food, but at the same time, for economic growth, employment, and so forth. We continue to have about 1/4 of the world's population be dependent on agriculture for their employment. And this can be much higher in some of the developing countries like Africa, where it is on an average about 60%, right? So I think how agriculture is important for international development is something that should not be spoken in this room, because I think that is stating something very, very obvious. But this is at a macro level. What I wanted to, and to bring in that perspective, I wanted to bring in a little bit from a micro level perspective. What does all these large agriculture data that we talk about, or these large food system data that we talk about mean? When you double click them, what does this mean to a small farming household in developing countries, right? And I wanted to take an example of an Eastern Indian state, Bihar, because I think in many, many ways, this state and its agriculture system resonates with a lot of developing country agriculture systems around the world. And therefore, I wanted to take the example of Bihar. How does a developing country, a typical farming household in developing country look like, right? It's usually say 5 people, depending on about 1.2, 1.5 hectares of land, very typically, and the average being 1.2, but let's see, one animal, most probably an indigenous variety of cow. This is how a typical household looks like. Their entire dependence on food, on most of the income is on that asset that they hold, or the lack of it. The reason I say that is Bihar, for example, close to 40% of Bihar's farmers are actually farmers who do not own land. And this is true for many, many developing countries. So a farmer whose definition often is by the amount of land that person owns is actually often not true. And therefore, landless people. And therefore, when you look at some of the countries, including the African Union at the moment, are changing their definition of 2 things. Number one is the definition of farmer. The farmer's definition, which classically has been, is to landholder, smallholder farmer being 1 hectare, a mid farmer being this many hectare. You know, we were always defining farmer by the land holding that that person owns, but that is now changing. And AU, for example, is bringing a new word called producer, right? And so therefore, a small scale producer, not defining an agriculture dependence on the basis of how much land that person owns, but defining it as how much produce that person brings to the market. And that is a big, big difference. And the reason I say that is a lot of these things depend upon whether you are owning a land or you are not owning a land. The market price, for example, this household, if this household did not own land, the price realization of that family of their produce can go down as low as 40% than a landowner. And one of the key reasons being in an XYZ village, and we have a lot of these data, say, for example, from sub-Saharan Africa as well. In an XYZ village, if there are, say, 300 farmers who have rented out somebody's land to use to cultivate their plants, right? Say, for example, they took the land on rent on 1st of November, and they are supposed to give it back on, say, 15th of July. Let's call it that, right? 15th of July, whether the crop is ready or not ready, they have to give the land back. And people who are buying, or the market players, know that this is the time when the crop, the land will come back. And therefore, around 15th of July, the prices of the market prices or buying prices of that produce often is at its bottommost. And yet that farmer has to harvest, and that farmer has to sell. And therefore, close to 30% of the market selling can be categorized as distress sale. Because A, there is no holding capacity. I mean, in developing countries like Bangladesh, for example, countries like India, the holding capacity of a farmer, or which means the farmer's ability to store his or her produce after it is harvested, is less than 4%. So only about 4% of the people can actually hold on to their produce till the market price is correct, or till they get better prices. Otherwise, you have to sell the moment it has come, it gets harvested. And so land holding becomes a major issue. Women farmers issues, and Madhura is here, who has published a lot on these issues. Women farmers issues also, there are many, but one of the key issue also is the land owning capacity. Again, India, for example, and Bihar, for that matter, less than 10% of India's land is owned by women. But about 46% of India's crop cultivation is done by women. And therefore, what happens is, when we say the gender factor in agriculture, this becomes a major challenge. So land is a major issue for this. Land is the biggest asset of this family, but land also is a very, very key fundamental challenge. And with land, I also want to talk about soil. We are actually in the process right now of working with a few countries in terms of some of their policies. As I said about land holding, land does not determine how good I am in terms of being a farmer. It is the soil that determines that. A farmer can be holding 20 acres of land, which according to the developing country definition can be a very large farmer. A farmer can be holding 20 acres of land, but if that land is arid and not producing anything, the farmer is considered, according to the policymakers and the government records, a large farmer, and therefore doesn't get a lot of benefits like subsidy and all that, because that person is owning, and I would say he, because most of the time it is he, but because he owns 20 acres of land, he is considered to be a very well-to-do farmer. But if the soil is arid, that farmer actually is one of the poorest of the poor farmer. And therefore, as against that, if there is a farmer who has only 1.5 hectares of land, but good soil and good access to irrigation, that farmer can be earning way much more than that 20 acre. And so that's another big policy shift that several countries are talking about right now, is to categorizing the farmer by the soil quality of the farm rather than the quantity of the farm. So that's another shift. And the reason I say these things is because all of these factors that I'm talking about later on, as we see, are very, very fundamental to impact of climate. And so there are several of these things, right? Mechanization. So this is a real issue. That farmers or that farm households average annual income is less than $1,200 a year, right? Out of that $1,200, about $1,200 a year income, close to $1,000 actually goes in that household's expenses. And therefore, the reason I wanted to say this also is there is very little bandwidth left for that farmer to really experiment on any of the new technologies or any of those things. And therefore, where the farmer invests with that kind of money, because a lot of those technologies you will be working on, but the farmer's decision to be able to put that very, very small amount of bandwidth that family has is very, very crucial. So unless that technology has a very, very direct impact on the farming household's income, it's going to be very difficult to sort of sell that technology to the farmer. So nutrition, we have the nutrition giant, Professor Pingali, sitting here. But I just wanted to bring this here also to say that it's not just, inclusiveness is not just about income. Inclusiveness is not just about who is farming, men or women, or what sector, livestock or crop or aquaculture and all that. Inclusiveness is also a lot about the output of agriculture, and one of the key one or the outcome being nutrition, right? Again, bringing an example of India, one of the largest producer of food in the world, a top commodity player in many essential commodities and so forth. So on one hand, we can generalize by saying enough food, but host the world's largest number of malnutrient people. And interestingly, among those malnutrient Indians, the maximum number are actually people who are dependent on agriculture in some way or other. It's not, I'm not here only to talk about sort of sad stories, because there are some, closer one goes to the ground, more optimistic one feels rather than pessimistic, because the kind of with that little bandwidth in terms of the income that they have to invest, with all those challenges that we spoke about, it is just frankly amazing to me how these revolutions after revolutions are being done, and done led by the farmers. And one of the fundamental right now being the mobile penetration. There is not a single government across the world who pays the farmers' mobile bills. Most governments across the world do pay the farmers' fertilizer bills, or in some form or other give subsidies for the farmer for irrigation, or some form of other give subsidy on seeds, whatever. But there is not a single government that buys or pays farmers' mobile bills. And yet, close to 80% of the households have access to cell phones. And that's because they see that as a very, very powerful tool. And that's because they see that as worth an investment from that very little bandwidth that they are left with annually. And it's such an equalizer. I have for many years lived and worked in Africa. And I have for many years lived and worked in South Asia. I have not seen a single technology that has felt so equalizing. And I think the cell phone technology and the way it is being used in agriculture is one of the most important technologies so far. And I think, it is changing the village dynamics in many ways. It is changing the extension. If you had noticed on the previous slide, till about 2015, the access to extension services by the farmers in India, for example, was 42%, which means only about 42% of the farmers had some access to extension services, right? And I know Cornell is very big about various extension approaches and so forth. Cell phone technology in 4 years has changed that. Today, there are, if one believes some of the recent data that has come in and things like that, only in Bihar, for example, there are over 36,000 WhatsApp groups by the farmers. What is very interesting about that, and that is something very interesting for academics like us, and that includes me, is also the kind of information that goes. Any classic extension services, and frankly, it includes the FAO's Farmer Field School or any of those extension systems that we have seen in countries, over 80% of the extension material or the extension messages were about production. And there was very little about market. It only, quote unquote, taught the farmer how to grow something better. It hardly taught the farmer about how to sell something better or how to optimize the price realization. The farmer's own extension services, which is through the cell phones or through their own WhatsApp group and all that, it is exactly the reverse. Most of these extension groups are actually talking about market information. Because my pet sentence to always say is, farmers in the world don't farm because they are interested in the country's food security. They farm because this is their livelihood. They farm because they want to make profit out of it. And market information, for some reason, we completely missed this out. That market information was the most important thing for the farmer. And therefore, if you see the farmer's own extension systems right now, most of the extension systems at the moment, majority of it talks about market information, where to sell, where to get the best prices, those kind of things, right? So it's a very, very interesting revolution. The second one I wanted to speak about is the aggregation of farmer, because that also is a huge inclusive lens, right? And Professor Pingali was telling me yesterday, they've been working a lot on farmer producer organizations, for example. What does that mean, right? It is actually changing the definition of what we can call as smallholder farmer. The reason being, if there is a single farmer with 1 hectare of land and going out there to buy, say, 2 little packets of seeds and 1 bag of fertilizer and taking 5 bags of corn to the market to sell, that person hardly has any agency. But when they come as a group, which is about, say, 1,200, 1,400 people, which is a typical farmer producer organization size, when 1,400 people come together, which is over 1,400 hectares of land, and therefore they have much more agency when they go and buy seed in bulk, when they go and buy fertilizer in bulk, so much more agency. Our own experience of some of the FPOs says that, the input cost goes down as much as about 20% because they have more negotiation power. And instead of 3 bags taking to the market, when they are taking, say, 5 truck loads of produce to the market, they have much more agency, and the price realization can go as high as 35 to 40% sometimes, right? So aggregation is a very, in a way, a very simple thing, but it is a very, very powerful tool. So I think there are some of these tools which are developing across the world. There needs much more than that, but these are some of the very, very fundamental tools that is making the structure inclusive, but at the same time bringing hope in making farming a little more profitable. This is so it's very interesting. An online service in Bangladesh, the growth of the online seed sale in a country like Bangladesh is the last 2 years, the growth has been at about 9%. Who would have thought that farmers would order seeds and ag inputs online? I would have never imagined that before. Because my first question, fundamental question that I would ask in my mind is, where is the electricity, for example? There are, in many countries now, there are entrepreneurs who go from village to village and charge about 10 rupees to charge a cell phone. And therefore, electricity is less of a burden, a barrier now. People's cell phone gets charged because they go with the solar screen and charge the cell phone for a charge, and then comes back next day, charges it again, and things like that. There are entrepreneurs who go with their little laptops to the villages, order things online for the villages, including in very small villages where people order buckets and things like that. Who would have thought that rural people with $1,200 of an annual income would become Amazon customers, for example? But they are. And so again, inclusiveness also brings a tremendous global opportunities. I wanted to talk a little bit about the larger aggregation, and a fantastic example of that, which is the milk cooperatives. But I'm going to skip because I'm also looking at the watch. But it just is just an example of how aggregation of large number of farmers can really turn the tables. And here I also wanted to point out a very, very, again, from a climate perspective, but at the same time, a big risk management strategy by the farmers, which is mixed farming system. So very interestingly, we often think of developing country agriculture as crop agriculture and livestock agriculture. India, for example, 83% of India's milk does not come from livestock farmers. It comes from crop farmers who also happen to keep a livestock in their field. And so it's a great risk management, risk mitigation strategy. So at the Gates Foundation, our strategy in agriculture, so agriculture is the largest actually program at the Gates Foundation at the moment. And our strategy, the reason the Gates Foundation invests in agriculture is not just because they're interested in agriculture, but because of the realization that agriculture continues to be a very, very important factor in addressing the larger poverty issues that we are interested in, right? 4 key goals of the agriculture program at the Gates Foundation. Productivity, so bridging the gap between the actual and potential yield, because there is tremendous gap, whether it is crop or livestock. So one is productivity. The second is income, because higher productivity or higher production in agriculture by default does not translate into higher income. Unless good production and better productivity is clubbed with good market strategies, the farmer actually does not get benefit out of it. And from a farmer perspective, I will never forget this, that a Nigerian farmer had long ago said, is that, today I grow 20 kilos of corn and not able to sell. Tomorrow, with your fantastic technology, I will grow 200 kilos of corn and not able to sell. How does it make any difference to me? And yet, most of our technology development efforts have been towards, okay, how do I increase yield, right? And therefore, I think productivity, one, income, second, because they are not mutually connected. The third is nutrition. Higher production or more food in the household or more food in the country does not by default, and India is a classic example, as I said earlier, does not by default translate into better nutrition levels. And therefore, nutrition is our third program. And we've worked very closely with Professor Pingali's group on that, especially in India. And the fourth being gender in agriculture, again, because of the various things I said. And not to, I mean, I did say the role women play in crop, but livestock, it is majority of that is women. About 70% of livestock work actually is done by women. And so women in agriculture is our fourth. So while we have been working on that, 3 years ago, if you would have asked, does the Gates Foundation work on climate change issues? The answer was not a very confident yes, because any of the investments that we've done in productivity gain, abiotic stress tolerance, biotic stress tolerance, any of those things, of course, can be sort of categorized as working towards climate, but we have not been very intentional so far on working on climate-related issues, and that has changed. Last year, it announced a very large climate portfolio, but being a very, very small global player in this entire big agriculture business, we wanted to be very intentional about what we do in climate. So we are not working on climate change per se. We are only focusing our efforts at the moment and on a steep learning curve on climate adaptation. And I want to say why. So, if one looks at the world productivity, right, between 1961 to 2015, the world productivity actually doubled in crops. It actually has doubled, which is a huge progress. But if it wasn't for climate-related factors, it would have been 18% higher. And 18% higher productivity or 18% higher agriculture productivity would mean at least 10% higher income, for example, to that household that we spoke about, a big contribution on GDP, a lot of other things, right? And so climate has been a major headwind, not just for the large global programs and strategies like ours and things like that, but a very, very major issue in our, as a world's ability to achieve anything in agriculture, any of the indicators. Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, 2 degrees would mean, impact on a lot of crop, impact on a lot of livestock, impact on a lot of farmers. Today, if one looks at South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia, for example, hosts 4 out of 10 most climate vulnerable countries in the world, right? And in 1 year's time, more than 80% of Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia's farmers will face a climate shock at least once a year. Which means you can imagine the impact on income, impact on everything that the earlier slide that spoke about. So climate is a major, major issue. And we always thought, and at least I'll speak for myself, 10 years ago when we sat in some conferences and people spoke about climate and all that, it always felt like something that's a future problem that we all need to talk about. But it is very, very, it's happening now, and there needs to be a lot of work that needs to be done. There is a lot of work, if one looks at the entire funding scenario of global agriculture funding scenario in last 4 years, over 80% of any new money that has come in agriculture, in spite of COVID, in spite of supply chain disruptions, all of that, Over 80% of the new money that has come in agriculture in last 4 years have been on around climate-related issues. So there is a lot of cognizance, there is a lot of resource mobilization, there is a lot happening. But there are two major problems to that. Number one, there are many, but I'll talk about two. Number one is most of the efforts are on mitigation. While mitigation is very, very necessary, adaptation and what do we do now? How do we deal with this higher temperature? How do we deal with these crop burning? How do we deal with the livestock producing 3 to 7% less milk? How do we deal with that right now? And how do we adapt to this situation? There is very little effort on that. So mitigation is very, very important to help us cope with the future crisis and mitigate the future crisis. But adaptation as it goes right now is also going to be very, very important. And there is very little effort on that. And that's one of the reasons why we decided to put our very limited money onto adaptation. The second big thing is, which again, thankfully is changing now. We as a world have spent a lot of our energy over last 10 to 15 years on diagnosing the problem. And our understanding of what the problem is, our understanding of where this whole thing is going has really evolved, and that's really very good. But we are very, very underinvested on solutions. And as we look at, okay, so what do we do? Okay, I know that the temperature in Cameroon is going to go up by 2 degrees and 100,000 farmers will be out of food and all of that. We know that we are kind of almost there in understanding the problem. I mean, I, in my role, sit with a lot of governments across the world, right? At various forums and all that. There is a lot of cognizance. There is nothing, nobody needs to be convinced that this is a huge problem, right? But there is hardly any solutions. And that's where I think, that's where the shared responsibility comes, because we really our understanding of the solution is in a very, very nascent stage, and the solution part of it is very, very underinvested. And so I think as we look at a lot of the adaptation part and sort of looking for solutions together, I think they can be in many, many ways, but improving productivity is one, but at the same time, diversifying the crops, right? Is the classic rice, wheat, corn systems the answer, or we will have to do the adaptation will mean diversifying the system to bring in other crops which are more climate friendly and more tolerant. Within the rice, wheat, corn system also, any R&D work on genetic gain, any genome selection, allele mining, all of that so far in the world has been very, very production centric. How do we get more yield? How do we get more quantity? And that was really needed in the world. It is still needed in the world. But the varietal selection, the genomic selection, the conventional breeding selection and effort now need to really shift very drastically towards what will survive the current and the future temperatures, for example. Managing variability and shocks, various vulnerable and making it inclusive, but I think policy, because climate and addressing of that is predominantly a policy issue. We can debate on this one, but at the moment, it is predominantly a policy issue. And again, not a country by country, but a transboundary policy issue. And there's a very interesting saying in India, in Eastern India, which says, smaller the farmer, their dependence on Ram and Raj, which is God and governance is highest. Smaller the farmer, they are much more dependent on the policies of subsidies and things like that. Their vulnerability towards nature, their vulnerability towards the changes of climate is much higher. And therefore, policy is not just something that, it's nice to sort of put the country on the map type thing, but I think smaller the number of smaller the farmer the country hosts, their thrust on adaptation policies, their thrust on mainstreaming climate-related policies across everything that they do is going to be much more important. And of course, the system resilience, I mean, not just again country by country, but global resilience. Just this year, for example, on 10th of May, India, in the north of India, they experienced a heat wave. And with heat wave, India took a quick decision of banning its wheat export. As it did that there, the next morning, the Chicago Exchange here opened with 6% higher price, right? So these are such global, systemic, connected issues. Terry is showing me I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to skip through this, but I just wanted to talk about some of the climate finance and a lot of finance that's coming up. One interesting point here is, yeah, it's not enough, but there is a lot of climate finance that is mobilizing in the world right now. Last year, for example, Africa, $29.7 billion was mobilized only for climate issues for Africa, which is a good amount of money. I'm not saying it is enough, but it was a good amount of money that came out from various multilateral development banks and so forth. So 29 point. However, within that 29 plus billion dollars that were raised for Africa, only 10 African countries out of 54 got about 60% of that money. So A, there are challenges. B, there are lack of capacities within countries to really, sort of find solution, cost the solution, and mobilize resources for the countries and have that solution. So I think it is not just about how much money the world is able to raise. I think it is also about where that money goes, on what areas, because very little is actually going on the ground in deploying and finding solutions. At the end, I just wanted to, end with this one, because this is a very interesting farmer from Rwanda who's a maize farmer, has been growing maize for 6 generations, right? But had to switch her crop last year because the maize production in that area went down because of weather variabilities, right? Now, switching the crop would also means for 6 generations, she knew how to grow maize. She knew which market to go to. She knew the technology. She knew where to go for seeds and all that. Switching the crop, all those will be a new challenge for her and a new need for capacity development at that farmer's field. And linking that to the air conditioners I saw in Ithaca, I think adaptation to climate is a universal need. We all are adapting, right? I mean, the temperature here went up. I wasn't expecting, coming from Delhi, that it would be hotter than Delhi, but I am adapting to it, right? I am adapting it. The whole of Ithaca is probably trying to adapt by putting those little air conditioner units there. So the adaptation need is universal. Adaptation capacity is drastically different. So for this farmer, for example, there is hardly any adaptation capacity, right? I mean, forget air conditioner. She's part of the 550 million Africans who do not have access to electricity, for example. And so I think finding solutions, adaptation is while we constantly put our efforts in mitigation, adapting to the situation is going to be very important. And I think how does various departments represented here can play in helping these farming systems adapt better is something that we can think about. Yeah, thanks, Terry.
Thanks so much, Purvi.